Okay, so good morning. So last week we talked about men and women's roles. This week we will continue to do it, and we go down to 1 Timothy chapter 2, down in verse 11. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. Let me tell you, every Bible teacher is so excited to deal with subjects like this in modern America. Why is a passage like that, before we go any further, why is a passage like that controversial? It's not always been controversial, by the way, historically over the course of the centuries, but why is it controversial now? It's counterculture, right? One of the aspects of our culture now is to say that men and women are exactly the same, which is such an odd statement when you actually think about it for even 1 nanosecond. But yeah, counterculture. What's another reason? I'll tell you Yeah, so that's another issue is the continued, again, kind of culturally belittling the role of a man and that aspect to it. Yeah. That another way that this becomes a problem is somebody could build a PowerPoint slide and just take 1 Timothy 2:11 and put it up there all on its own, and there's not a lot of context, and that might send the wrong message, right? Because if you take some of these passages out of context, you could walk away saying, okay, well, men are better than women, or women are less than men, and historically, have there been periods of time where women have been treated really poorly? Yeah, you don't have to read a lot of history to find that that has 100% been the case, right? The role of women within the church is a controversial subject for a variety of reasons. One, it's counterculture. Two, it deals with men and women and the differences between the two, and it's very easy to step on each other's toes with that, right? Because how many times have men spoken to women and not understood how to say it in a way that is dealing in an understanding way with women? How many times have women spoken to men and the men hear it the wrong way, right? That sort of thing happens all the time. So a couple of things that we want to do here. So one, actually, before we even progress in that, let's back up. 1 Timothy chapter 3, down in verse 15. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15 gives you some context to the whole book. Paul is talking to Timothy, and Timothy is an evangelist who is in the Ephesus area and dealing with the church there. And in verse 15, he said, well, back at verse 14, I'm writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long, but in case I am delayed, I write so you'll know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. The context to this entire book is, how does the church function together as a group of people? This is not dealing with individual circumstances, it's dealing with collective action as a congregation. And there's a significant difference between those two things. And, for example, do you have any examples in the Bible of women in leadership roles in the Bible but outside of the church? Deborah would be one. Yeah, Deborah would be one. Who made Deborah a judge over Israel, by the way? God did it, right? So now there's context to that. But there is a case. Are there any cases of Christian women teaching men outside of the context of the church? In other words, as individuals, where a woman is involved in teaching a man? Yeah. Priscilla and Aquila is a great example, right? Priscilla and Aquila, they taught who? Apollos, right? And it's very clear. It doesn't say, that, Aquila did it and Priscilla happened to be standing 15 feet away. It's Priscilla and Aquila taught him the way of God more accurately. But is that in the context of a worship service? It's individual, right? So 1 Timothy 3 says, look, this is how we behave within the household of God, within the work of the church. We're not talking about in all circumstances. The other thing is, we have to understand the context of the words and even definitions. So that word silence means quietness. It's a description of the life of one who stays at home doing his own work, does not officiously meddle with the affairs of others. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, it talks about those who with quietness work. In other words, they're not complainers and grumblers and that sort of thing. In Acts chapter 22, it describes those who were listening to Paul as he was teaching. They were silent. They were taking in the information. The idea of silence in this case matches directly into the things that we've talked previously, that the local church, within the context of the local church, men are to be in these leadership roles, right? And so that silence is not complete silence, right? In fact, what would happen if we were literal about complete silence? So we took this as women have to be completely silent during the worship service. Yeah, some of you men better learn soprano, right? It would be a problem, wouldn't it? This is not physical, literal, complete silence. This is talking in the context of leadership. So 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, he says, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. Again, the context here matters with this. We've just talked about men's and women's roles and the kind of people they ought to be. One of the things that we are trying to do within the Lord's body is raise Christian men who will be leaders in their families. Right? That's one of the biblical goals, is that men would grow up to be leaders in their families. And we're going to move into the next chapter. We're going to talk about shepherds, elders, men who would lead in that capacity. But in order to do that, we've got to give them opportunity to do it. And so that's one of the key ideas. The other word that kind of is a hot button word is submission. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, that same word is used. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Submission is not a bad word. It just is in modern America. Submission is something that we're all called to do at different times. If you love other people and they have needs and you have needs, or they have wants and you have wants, what are you called to do if you love other people? You put your wants beneath theirs. You know what that's doing? Submitting. In 1 Peter 5, young people are to submit to elders, and who else is supposed to submit? 1 Peter 5:5. Look at that verse. Somebody said it. All of us, right? All of you. All of you are to be submissive to one another. By the way, I also know there's like this weird thing that happens when you teach on this subject, and you have that verse up there. Women don't want to say anything. Is this a worship service? No. No, this is not. Is all the church here and we are all gathered together to worship the Lord right now? No. One, are all the adults of the congregation here? When we take the Lord's Supper, all the adults are supposed to be here, all of the Christians, and we're to wait for one another, right? Create a time. Is in this class right now, are all the adults here? Well, yeah, one, your wife's, I cannot believe she's forsaking the assembly. Your wife is back there teaching. She's teaching a class, isn't she? Yeah, that's one. We also have another adult class in the back that is being taught at the same time, right? So this is not the assembly. So this is a class environment, right? But the idea of women remaining completely silent, one, is it complete silent even during the worship? No, otherwise you couldn't sing. But the other is we're not talking here about worship, so women can talk. Okay, so if I ask a question, you are allowed to answer it. Do not feel bad. And see, it's a funny thing that happens. We take that verse out of context just because I even throw it up there. Everybody, one of the things we can see as we look at these words in the Bible, one, everyone must show a quietness at times. If quietness is not physical silence, but is instead an attitude to do your own work and do not meddle with the affairs of others. If I were to tell you who should do their own work and not meddle with the affairs of others, what's the answer to that? Everybody, right? It all depends on context. One of the things that God is working in the lives of men during the worship service is an opportunity for them to learn to lead. We've got to give them that opportunity to learn to lead so we can train them up in order to do that. That's a time for that. And one wonderful blessing that women can provide in that is allowing that to happen even as the men do not always do it well. Right? Another, everybody has to submit to someone. Right? Submission is just a part of life. And it, again, requires context. Right? Are there times where a man might have to submit to a woman? If you work for a company and your boss is a woman, do you have to submit to her? Yes, you do, right? Otherwise, you get fired, right? So it's all about context, right? This context is talking about the worship of the church. 1 Corinthians 14, let your women, that does not show up very well, so I'll read it out loud for you, for those of you who can't read it who have normal vision, because you can't read that unless you have like bat vision. No, that would be the opposite. Bats don't have good vision. 1 Corinthians 14:34, let your women keep silent. It would be eagle vision. That would be what you would have to have. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. Okay, so one, as the law also says, this is 1 Corinthians 14. What law is being referred to there in 1 Corinthians 14? Law of Moses. Under the law of Moses, the design was for families and who was supposed to step up and lead. Go all the way back to Genesis after the garden, who was supposed to step up and lead? Men, right? So here, again, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak. What's the context of that? Does that mean women are never permitted to speak if they are Christians? You go to the grocery store and you just have to like pantomime at them. No, it's all about context, right? The context is allowing men the opportunity to lead, because in the same way that we have homes that are families with different varying roles, of which we've just talked about in the previous verses, what is the church also referred to as? It's called the church, it's called the kingdom, but it's also called the bride of Christ. Another term, one more. The family, the household of God, right? And that's the terminology that's used in 1 Timothy 3:15, the household of God. We are a family. There is the nuclear family, there is the church family, and there's an imitation of some of these patterns. Okay, so a couple of different things to remember about this passage. This passage pertains to public worship and forbids women taking an active role in the public worship and teaching of the church. Word silence deals with a quiet demeanor, not absolute silence. God says one reason for this is the creation design of the home, marriage, family. Eve was Adam's helpmeet, and Adam was responsible to lead. And the last is the other reason is that Eve was beguiled, but not Adam. When Adam failed to lead, Eve both sinned. When you go back to the garden, who is actually blamed for the sins of Adam and Eve? Adam is, for his lack of leadership. So the biblical pattern, one of the things to remember is that biblical leadership is not about power, it's about responsibility. Right? The best leader to ever walk this earth was Jesus. Did he emphasize his power, or did he emphasize his responsibility as he lived? How did he describe his leadership? Tell us to lead. Serve, right? Remember, as he prepared to go on the cross, which was part of his leadership, because when we follow Christ, he says, take up your cross and follow after me. Right? So Jesus goes to the cross first. We're supposed to follow in submission to him. Before instituting the Lord's Supper, what did he do to his apostles? Anybody remember? He washed their feet. And Peter had a problem with that. He's like, you are the rabbi. We are the disciples. We should be washing your feet. And Jesus made it very clear, no, this is what biblical leadership looks like. And so it's just important with all these things to put this in context of all of those bigger principles. You will find your whole life that people will take passages like 1 Timothy 2:11, take them out of context, and use that to criticize Christianity. When in reality, Christianity has done more for elevating the value of women than any other religion before it. The fact of the matter is, biblically speaking, men and women are different, but they are equal. Whose soul matters more, according to the New Testament? A man's or a woman's? It's equal, right? Both are equal. And the scriptures are quite clear on that. When Jesus was preaching, who tended to and cared for his needs? And they're given credit for it. It was a group of women. Who were the first people to show up at the empty tomb? Women. Over and over and over again, there is a biblical picture of elevating the role of women, elevating the value of women in a way that the culture of the time did not do. So we want to keep all of those things in mind as we look at this. But context of 1 Timothy 2 is we're talking about to use the more fancy term, the corporate worship and work of the church. In that context, we're not talking about individual Christians in individual circumstances. Anybody have any questions or comments or anything like that before we move forward? Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that's a great example, right? So the church as a group is limited in a lot of things, one of those being how we spend our money and resources, right? We as individuals have a much broader, it's all about context, right? And keeping those things in mind as we study and not ripping things out of their context. So somebody else have a comment? Absolutely. That's a great example, right? It isn't, was Jesus a less person than Mary and Joseph? No, of course not. But did he submit to his parents? Absolutely, because there's a design there within God's structure. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example of it. In fact, next time I teach, I'm going to use that one. So that's perfect. Okay. Now, from there we move to 1 Timothy chapter 3. It's a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. What we're going to do is, some of this we just went through as a congregation. So if you take 1 Timothy 3 and you look at the qualifications there, then you go over to Titus chapter 1 and you look at the qualifications there. That's why I had both of those be your reading for this previous week leading up to this class. Next week's reading will be 1 Timothy 4. If you ever have any question about what the reading is, look at the bottom of the handout. It'll always be there. We're going to summarize some of these things because, at least in part, we've just been through it as a congregation in the appointment of new elders. The terminology, depending on where you're at, either in 1 Timothy or Titus or Acts, is elder or overseer. If you like King James, good on you for reading 1611 King James. It's bishop. It's shepherd or pastor. Those are all terminologies that are used for them. I am not an elder. I am not an overseer. I am not a shepherd, which means I'm also not a pastor, right? Okay, so we have 5 of them, and none of them are me. And I like to emphasize that because that's kind of the world we live in, right? Culturally, people walk into a church building for the first time, they hear the guy who's speaking on Sunday, and they assume he's the pastor, right? And that's another problem. When you talk about who's the pastor, what's the problem with that issue? There's no example of the pastor in the New Testament. It's always pastors, elders, shepherds, a plurality. So here in 1 Timothy chapter 3, as well as in Titus, Timothy is left in Ephesus. Titus is left on the island of Crete. Part of their job is to help the congregations to appoint biblical elders. Now, they will be told, if you look in Titus as well as Timothy, that's your job. Timothy, Titus, appoint elders. But then, what you end up seeing in reality is that they end up giving qualifications for those. That's their job. It was my job when we went from 3 to 5 to appoint elders at Eastland. Or to not appoint elders at Eastland if we didn't have any more qualified. It was my job. I needed to make sure that happened and make sure that happened in the right way. And yet, in one sense, it's not my job. How did I appoint elders in Eastland just a couple months ago? Did I pick them? No. Did I tell you, hey, this is the person you pick? Is that what I did? Did I do that for anybody? Maybe you come up and say, Scott, who should I put down on the form? And I tell you? No. In fact, if any of you had, nobody did, but if anybody had, I would have said, I'm not going to tell you what name to put on there. I refuse. Yeah, you fill in the blank yourself. That's right. What I did was just show you what the Holy Spirit says. That's my job. And that was Timothy and Titus's job. Here are the qualifications. We'll talk about 2 aspects of this. We'll talk about what the job is, and then we'll kind of break the qualifications down into some grouping. One, the job, and you can see this in multiple places, is that the church's, the eldership is the first line of defense against division. We see places like 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where there was somebody in an open, clear sin, and they are attempting to just exist in that sin and also be a part of the church. And that had to be dealt with. The eldership is front line of defense for the discipline of members. They're also first line of defense for things like when false teaching comes in. That's their job to take care of those sorts of things. They're also supposed to be proactive peacemakers. Keeping peace is not an easy thing. If it was an easy thing, we wouldn't be told, as far as depends on you, be at peace with all men. Right? That sort of phraseology exists. Any sort of command to do something tells you, oh, it's not an easy thing to do. Peace is hard to keep. And the more people you have, the harder it is to keep that peace. Why? We're all different. Right? Lots of different views, lots of different opinions. We are busting at the seams right now, which is a wonderful problem. But raise your hand if you have an opinion about how we could handle that. I got opinions. I have no responsibility, though, which is the sweet spot in life, right? To have opinions and no responsibility, right? How do you get people who have lots of different opinions on how a problem should be handled to have peace? Good leadership. Good leadership. Throughout the New Testament, you see this reality that there are going to be times where there are troubles not just outside the church, but troubles inside the church. Some of those troubles are false teaching, or disciplinary issues, but sometimes they're like in Philippians 4, where it's just two people who have a hard time getting along. Both good people, but their personalities clash. Elderships are involved in that process. Another aspect of it is distributing the money of the church. There is a reality that you can go back and you can see, even all the way back to before there were elders in the church in Jerusalem, who functioned as the elders in the very beginning. The apostles did. Yeah, the apostles did. Before they were appointed elders, the apostles were the ones doing this in the church of Jerusalem. And when money was gathered in Jerusalem by the saints, whose feet did they lay it at? Not Jesus. The apostles. You're right. Yeah, no. So I should have given context. Once the church had shown up, right, then they would gather money and they would lay it at the apostles' feet. And they would distribute as any had need. Now, does that mean that they were handling every dollar in every circumstance personally in the distribution? We know that's not the case because something happens in Acts 6. They appoint deacons over caring for the widows, right? So the apostles have the money. They have to make sure it gets distributed. Does that mean that they're doing all the individual things? It's like, we need a new broom. John Prosser's got to buy it. It's the only biblical way to do it is John Prosser's got to buy every new broom, right? No, of course not. That's not at all. But there is the oversight there of that. That's going to require both an attitude of being compassionate givers, right? If the eldership is made out of tightwads, is that going to work? There's going to be a problem, right? On the other hand, what if they are like Oprah? You know, everybody gets a car. Like, that's not going to work either, right? So they got to be faithful stewards. There's a combination of those things because of the nature of that work. And then also the preaching and teaching. Now, here, this is a great example of how they don't have to do all of it. Right now, who's doing the bulk of at least the public preaching and teaching? Yeah, it's me. I'm doing most of it. If you were to clock the hours doing it, it's mostly me. But I do it because who has asked me to? The elders. And I have the responsibility to do it as long as they continue to delegate that responsibility to me. There's a need to feed and guard the sheep. There's a need to tend the flock. All of those things are part of the work of an eldership. So that's the job. And with that in mind, I kind of have taken the different qualities that if you look in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus chapter 1, you kind of gather these together. I've grouped them. Okay? You could probably group them another way. This is just a way that I've grouped them that helps me to kind of think of it in chunks. One, what is their attitude and disposition? There are some people who are just kind of, they may be Christians who are faithful to God, but they have a prickly disposition, right? That's not going to work. So one, their attitude is they have to desire the work. That's an important idea. What if a guy meets all the qualifications, but he just doesn't, look, I'm tired. I don't want to do the work anymore. Is he qualified? What? You raising your hand because that's you? Like, I don't want to do the work. Mm-hmm. Too much for one man. That's a great example of that delegation principle. Absolutely. Yeah. So if you have a man, he has to want the work, and there may be a season of his life where he does and a season where he doesn't. I'm going to say something to you that is a struggle that I have seen shepherds have as long as I've been preaching. There is a feeling amongst shepherds sometimes that when they are chosen by the congregation to lead, which is a huge honor that you've given them, that is a lifetime appointment. Meaning, if I ever stop shepherding, if I ever say I don't want to be an elder, I have somehow sinned. That is not true. And in fact, I think the propagation of that idea that a guy has to do it his whole life until they bury him is damaging to him, and it also can be damaging to the congregation. It's okay for a guy to say, I want to do this for a season, I've got the energy, I've got the time, I've got the desire, but then life changes, and all of a sudden, he goes, I need to step away from it. Has he sinned in doing that? No, and we need to give them the freedom to do that. We need to give them the freedom to not, if a man said, I'll give you an example without using names, but a friend of mine, he has older kids and then he has younger kids. And he served as an elder, and then his younger kids are now at a point where he's like, you know what, I need to give them more time. And so he stepped down from being an elder. And half of the congregation said, guess what the question was? The first question he got from half the congregation is, what's wrong? What does that imply? That him stepping down requires something to be wrong. There wasn't anything wrong. There was something right. This is a guy who said, I want to manage my own household, and I've got some younger kids who need some extra attention right now. Isn't that exactly the kind of man you want him to be? So we should work as God's people to normalize a man saying, I did this for a season, and now I'm done, and maybe I might want to do it again later. I don't know. Right? You don't have a crystal ball, and neither do they. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you look at a man who's going to be elder, before he's an elder, he's a father and he's a husband. If those two are getting neglected for him to do elder work, there actually is sin, right? But if he steps down to say, I need to, that's not sinful. So, yeah, that's a great point. Great point. So there's character traits and attitudes he's got to have. He's got to be a sensible person. You've got to feel like I could talk to this guy, right? He's got to be temperate and patient and gentle, all those sorts of things. You have to see certain behaviors that he has towards others. Not a striker or brawler. He's not hot-tempered, right? He's not somebody who, as soon as you disagree with him, he's going to just shoot right to the roof and get mad. Well, not right away. Yeah, early Peter. Maybe Peter later, I think, did a better job, right? But he's got to be given to hospitality. One of the aspects of hospitality that we forget about, a lot of times I think we think of hospitality as, okay, you have a house and you have people over. That is an aspect of hospitality. But hospitality in and of itself is, look, what's mine is yours. If you need a lawnmower because yours is blown up and I have one you can borrow, I'm the kind of guy who would lend it to you. That's hospitality as well. But as you look at hospitality, what does that tell you about his attitude and disposition towards people? If he's a hospitable person, he cares about their needs. He thinks about them. He thinks about how he can help them. And so that's an aspect of it. Relation to God's Word, he's living it, and he's capable of teaching it. There are people who are capable of teaching it who aren't living it. And there are people who are living it but are not capable of teaching it. Right? So there is a difference between those two things. They are related, but they are not the same. And the other thing that goes along with that is he's got to be living it, he's got to be capable of teaching it, but it also, the 15th one I have down there, he's got to be able to convict the gainsayer. I like using old-timey language with these because it makes you think about it. What's a gainsayer? Gainsayer is somebody who is disagreeing and is wrong, right? So here is somebody who has a teaching, has an idea that is, and they are trying to propagate it and destroy the church. They've got to be able to convict the gainsayer. they've got to be able to have the hard conversations too. And there's lots of people who can teach the Bible, live the Bible, but when it comes to the hard conversations, they don't want to have them. But look, if you're dealing with people, you're going to have hard conversations sometimes. In regards to the world, one of my favorite ones is the number 20 I have up there, good testimony from them that are without. Those who are not Christians, if they look at this man in the context of living out in the world, do they think of him as just like all the rest of us, or do they see something different? Right? If a man is qualified to be an elder, that should be something that stands out not just to Christians, but to the people that they work with, the people, their neighbors, all the other people in their life. They're not given to wine. They're people of self-control. They don't have the love of money. They're blameless people. If somebody said something bad about them, one way to think of blamelessness is if somebody said something bad about them, you'd be surprised. You go, oh, that doesn't really match so-and-so. That's not how I think of them. They have a reputation that way. In regards to his family, he's a one-woman man, the literal translation of husband and one wife. He's known for his faithfulness to his bride. He's the father of believing or faithful children. And he rules his own household well. And his wife also has qualifications. Because has there ever been an example in life of a man who's a good man, but he's married to a not-so-great woman? And could that possibly impact his ability to lead? Right? Huge impact, right? At the end of the day, that man, guess who has his ear more than anybody else? Always going to be his wife, right? And so there's qualifications for her as well. Any comments, questions, thoughts? Yes. Right. Yep. I understand. Yes, I understand exactly the question. So here is a problem that we run into with qualifications, especially that relate to other human beings, right? In regards to his family, right? So one of the things that we have to understand is all of these qualifications, every single one of them, you're going to, as an individual in the congregation, have to have an opinion. Let me take one that's easier to understand than that one to use as an example. Apt to teach, meaning he has the ability and the capability of teaching. When does a man go from not apt to teach to apt to teach? Where's the point? Where's the moment? I know some guys who are not apt to teach, and I know some guys who are apt to teach. So we're on a spectrum here. We're going to start over here, not apt to teach. All of you men over here are not apt to teach right now. Not apt to teach, and we keep moving, we keep moving, we keep moving, and eventually over there we're going to get to apt to teach. Where's the point? Where's the moment? See, the problem is it's really, really difficult to pinpoint that moment, right? So everybody has to have an opinion. One of the things that I think is beautiful about the way God has designed it is He gives us a qualification. So we look at the qualifications given to us by the Holy Spirit, and then we as a congregation have to say, okay, in our opinion, this man is apt to teach. I know him, you know him, and across that spectrum, we all have said yes. So when you talk about a father of faithful children, there is an area in which everybody's going to be clear that it's good, right? So we start over here. He's raised 19 children. All 19 are faithful to the Lord at all times, and they're growing up, and they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s themselves now, and they're still just doing great. No questions, right? We're all good there. Now, over here, he's raised kids, and not a single one of them has obeyed the Lord. Not a single one of them has come to obey Jesus. Well, that one's pretty clear, too. That's super easy, right? What you're asking is, okay, what if he raises kids they obey the Lord, but then at some of them struggle in their faith and fall away, or have any, that they just don't serve the Lord anymore. You're going to get a lot of opinions on that. And I will put it this way, is that we should churn over that. As Christians, when a man we're thinking of him in that capacity, we ought to think about that. But I think the text is somewhat vague for a reason, in the same way that it's somewhat vague about out to teach. It's clear, but there's room for understanding and applying in a specific circumstance. Because there's a difference between a guy who, look, his kids have been faithful, now they're in their 50s, and one of them falls away. But, all through the childhood, all past, well on. And there's another difference between that and, okay, he raised the kids, they obeyed the gospel, and then as soon as they left the house, the moment they left his doorstep, boom, they're gone. Do you see a difference between those two? Yeah, I do too, right? And I think we have to factor those things in. But in terms of how much responsibility does he have for fathering, right? That's the question. How long is he doing the fathering and that responsibility there? Which I know is not, I'm not giving you a clear answer, but I also think it's because there isn't a clear answer. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, Perry, I think you had something. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I 100% agree. I would also say, even if a man may consider himself to still be qualified, maybe one of his kids falls away later in life and he goes, I feel like I'm still qualified, but 30% of the congregation doesn't. What would good shepherding do in that circumstance? If 30% of the congregation is going to leave or be tore up over it, what's the right thing to do? Step down, right? Because remember that whole being an active peacemaker bit? Yes. Mm-hmm. So if you're asking me personally, yes, I don't believe his children have to be alive in order for him to be qualified. He does have to raise them. There is question about does one child count as children? Now, I'm at time and I know it, but let me put it this way. Compare it to something else we'll run into later in 1 Timothy. A widow. If a widow has children, they're supposed to support her, right? So imagine there's a widow in the congregation and she has one kid. And he goes, I don't have to take care of mom. It says if she has children, she has child, I'm going to take care of her. Would any of us buy that argument? No, so the term is a plurality of classification. Does he have children is a classification. If somebody has one kid and you ask them, do you have kids? What do they say? Yes, I have one, right? That is my understanding of that. Other people feel differently, and that also is something that we need to factor in the process of appointing elders. Again, if half the congregation feels like, hey, he only has one kid, I don't feel like he's qualified, should that be considered in the process? I think it should. So does that help answer the question some? Okay, perfect. Great. We will close down there and pick up next week in chapter 4.